Every night while others laughed and walked away, Busisiwe quietly packed leftover food into a worn plastic bag, food they called waste. Her co-workers mocked her manager warned her, and some even whispered that she was stealing. But she never defended herself. She just kept going, night after night. Until one evening, a powerful billionaire named Mr. Nkosi decided to follow her. He expected to expose a lie. Instead, what he discovered in the darkness of Johannesburg would break something inside him and reveal a truth no one in that restaurant was ready to face. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your country and local time in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Busisiwe had learned a long time ago that survival in Johannesburg did not come with kindness. It came with endurance. Every morning before the sun rose while the city was still wrapped in a fragile silence, she would wake up on a thin mattress laid over a cold cement floor in a cramped shack in Alexandra township. The air was always heavy, sometimes with dust, sometimes with smoke, but most often with the quiet weight of struggle. She lived alone, but not entirely. The echoes of her past, the hunger she once knew, and the memories of those who had helped her survive still lived with her. They whispered to her in the early hours, reminding her why she could not afford to give up, not even for a single day. By 5 a.m., Busisiwe would already be on her feet, wrapping her faded scarf tightly around her head, stepping into worn-out shoes that had long lost their shape. Her reflection in the cracked mirror hanging by a nail showed a young woman with tired eyes, but there was something deeper beneath that exhaustion, something unbroken. The journey to work was long and unforgiving. She walked most of the way, passing crowded taxi ranks, street vendors setting up their stalls, and children already roaming barefoot on dusty streets. The world moved fast around her, but Busisiwe carried herself with a quiet steadiness, as if she had learned to move through chaos without letting it swallow her whole. The restaurant where she worked sat in a much wealthier part of the city, Sandton, where glass buildings reflected sunlight and expensive cars lined the streets. It was a place that felt like another world entirely. Inside, everything was polished, controlled, and designed to impress. Customers came dressed in elegance, speaking in confident tones, living lives Busisiwe could only observe from a distance. To them, she was invisible. Busisiwe worked as a cleaner and kitchen assistant, a position that required her to move quickly but remain unnoticed. She wiped tables before customers even realized they were dirty, collected plates with quiet efficiency, and spent hours in the back kitchen washing dishes until her fingers wrinkled and her arms ached. Her uniform was always clean, but it had faded from too many washes. It hung loosely on her frame, a silent reflection of how little she had. Yet she wore it with dignity, never allowing herself to appear careless, even when no one seemed to care about her at all. Most of her co-workers did not understand her silence. Some thought she was strange. Others thought she was weak. But the truth was simpler. Busisiwe had learned that in a world that often misunderstood people like her, silence was safer than explanation. Among the staff were Thandi and Lerato, two waitresses who moved through the restaurant with confidence and sharp tongues. They noticed everything, especially Busisiwe. "She doesn't talk much, does she?" Lerato once whispered, watching Busisiwe scrub a tray in the sink. Thandi smirked. "People like her always have something to hide." Busisiwe heard them. She always did. But she never reacted. She kept her head down her hands, busy her thoughts elsewhere. Because the truth was, she did have something to hide. Every night after the last customer had left and the lights dimmed slightly, the restaurant would begin its quiet closing routine. Plates were cleared, surfaces wiped down, and perfectly good food was thrown away. Meals untouched, bread still fresh, portions barely eaten. To everyone else, it was waste. To Busisiwe, it was something else, entirely. She would wait carefully, making sure no one was watching too closely. Then with cautious hands, she would begin to collect what remained. Not everything, only what was still clean, still safe. She would wrap it neatly, placing it into a simple plastic bag she kept hidden in her locker. Her movements were quick, practiced, almost invisible. But her heart was never at ease. Every time she did it, there was a risk of being seen, a risk of being misunderstood, a risk of losing the only job that stood between her and absolute hunger. And yet she never stopped, because for Busisiwe, this was not about survival alone. It was about something deeper, something rooted in memories she could never forget. There had been a time years ago when she was the one standing outside, watching others eat. A time when her stomach burned with hunger so sharp it made her dizzy. A time when she had nothing, no home, no family, no certainty of tomorrow. And in that darkness, someone had shown her kindness. That memory lived inside her, like a quiet flame guiding her every decision, reminding her that even the smallest act of compassion could change a life. So every night while others laughed and went home, Busisiwe stayed a little longer. She packed the food, she tied the bag, she walked out into the night. No one knew where she went, no one asked. But there were whispers. "I've seen her take food," Lerato said one evening, her voice low but filled with judgment. Thandi raised an eyebrow. "Of course she does. People like her always find a way to steal. It's just a matter of time before Mr. Dlamini finds out." Busisiwe, standing just a few feet away, felt the words settle heavily in her chest. Not because they were new, but because they were familiar. Accusations, assumptions, labels. She had lived with them her whole life. Still she said nothing, because some truths could not be explained in words. They had to be seen, and one day, whether she was ready or not, they would be. As the night deepened and the city lights flickered against the dark sky, Busisiwe stepped out of the restaurant once again, the small bag of food held tightly in her hand. Her footsteps were quiet. Her purpose was not. Somewhere beyond the bright streets and towering buildings in places most people chose not to see, there were people waiting, hungry, forgotten, and tonight, just like every other night, Busisiwe was going to find them, unaware that for the first time, someone was beginning to watch. By the time the sun reached its highest point over Johannesburg, the restaurant had already transformed into a world of noise, movement, and quiet competition. Orders flew from table to kitchen plates, clattered, and voices overlapped in a constant rhythm that never seemed to pause. For most of the staff, it was just another busy day. But for Busisiwe, every shift carried something heavier, an invisible weight she had learned to carry without complaint. She moved swiftly between tables, her steps careful, her presence almost ghost-like. She cleared dishes before customers noticed, wiped surfaces until they shined, and slipped back into the kitchen without drawing attention. It wasn't that she didn't exist. It was that people had learned not to see her, and in that invisibility, others found space to speak freely. She was doing it again. "Last night," Lerato said, leaning casually against the counter while pretending to polish a glass. Her eyes flicked toward Busisiwe, who was quietly stacking plates nearby. Thandi followed her gaze, a slow smile forming on her lips. Of course she was. You think someone like her can resist free food? It's not just taking leftovers, Lerato added, lowering her voice slightly, but not enough to hide it. I think she takes more than that, maybe even before customers are done. Thandi let out a soft laugh. Wouldn't surprise me. Hunger makes people do desperate things. The words floated through the kitchen like smoke, thin, sharp, impossible to ignore. Busisiwe's hands paused for just a fraction of a second. Then she continued. That was always her way. Pause, breathe, continue, because reacting would only feed them, and explaining Explaining had never worked. There were people in the world who did not listen to understand. They listened to confirm what they already believed. And Thandi and Lerato had already decided who Busisiwe was. A thief. A desperate girl from the township who didn't know her place. They didn't see the careful way she selected only untouched food. They didn't see how she wrapped it with respect as if it still held value. They didn't see the intention behind her actions. They only saw what they wanted to see. Later that afternoon, as the lunch rush began to slow, Busisiwe retreated to the back kitchen. The air there was thick with steam and the lingering scent of spices. Her arms ached, her feet throbbed, but she kept working, scrubbing plates with steady, practiced movements. Water splashed against her hands, warm at first, then slowly cooling as time passed. She focused on the rhythm of it, the repetition that allowed her mind to drift, even if only for a moment. But peace never lasted long. Busisiwe. The voice cut through the noise like a blade. She turned slightly, her posture straightening instinctively. Mr. Dlamini stood at the kitchen entrance, his expression unreadable but firm. He was a man who carried authority in his silence, someone who didn't need to raise his voice to be feared. "Yes, sir," she replied softly. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as if studying her. "I've been hearing things." Busisiwe felt her chest tighten, but her face remained calm. "I don't know what you mean, sir." Mr. Dlamini folded his arms. "Don't play games with me. Food has been going missing, and your name keeps coming up." The words hung heavily in the air. Behind him she could feel eyes watching Thandi Lerato and a few others who had conveniently paused their work just long enough to witness the moment. Busisiwe swallowed slowly. "I only take what is left after closing," she said carefully. "Food that is going to be thrown away." Mr. Dlamini's expression hardened. "That is not your decision to make. It would just go to waste. I said that is not your decision." He snapped his voice sharp enough to silence the entire kitchen. The room went still. Busisiwe lowered her gaze slightly, her fingers tightening around the edge of the sink. "I'm sorry, sir." Mr. Dlamini leaned in just enough for his words to feel personal. "Let me make this clear." He said, his tone cold and controlled. "If I catch you taking anything again, even leftovers, you will lose this job. Do you understand? A single moment. That was all it took." In that moment, Busisiwe felt the fragile balance of her life tilt. This job, no matter how small it seemed to others, was everything to her. It paid for her food, her space, her survival. Without it, there was nothing. "Yes, sir," she whispered. He straightened, giving her one last look before turning away. "Good. Because I don't tolerate theft in my restaurant." The word lingered long after he left. Theft. It echoed in Busisiwe's mind, heavier than the accusation itself. Because deep down she understood something no one else in that room cared to consider. Sometimes the line between survival and wrongdoing was drawn by people who had never known hunger. The kitchen slowly returned to life. Conversations resumed, though now they carried a different tone, one of quiet satisfaction. Thandi walked past Busisiwe, her shoulder brushing slightly against hers. "You should be careful," she said, her voice laced with mock concern. "Not everyone gets second chances." Lerato smirked from across the room. "Or maybe she thinks she's special." Busisiwe said nothing. She simply turned back to the sink, letting the water run over her hands once more. But inside, something shifted. Not anger, not resentment. Something stronger. Resolve. Because the truth was, she had already made her choice long before this moment. Long before the whispers, long before the warnings. That choice had been made on a night much colder than this one, under circumstances far more desperate. And she had never regretted it. Even now, she didn't. As the evening approached and the restaurant prepared for another busy night, Busisiwe moved through her duties with the same quiet determination. No one noticed the way her eyes lingered slightly longer on the plates being cleared. No one noticed the way her fingers tightened just a little more when untouched food was thrown into the bin. But she noticed, she always did, because to her every wasted meal carried a memory, a reminder, a reason. When the final customer left and the closing routine began, once more Busisiwe stood at the edge of the kitchen watching. Her heart beat steadily, though the risk now felt greater than ever. Mr. Dlamini's warning echoed in her mind. "If I catch you again, you will lose this job." She looked at the bin, then at the untouched food, then down at her own hands. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. Was it worth it? Was it worth risking everything? The question lingered, but the answer came just as quickly. Yes, because somewhere out there beyond the lights of the city and the walls of this restaurant, there were people who had nothing, people who were waiting, people who had no voice, no choice, no one to stand for them, just like she once had. Busisiwe took a slow breath. Then with careful practiced movements, she stepped forward once more. Not as a thief, but as someone who refused to let hunger win. And tonight, despite the warnings, despite the judgment, despite the risk, she would do what she had always done. She would choose kindness, even if it cost her everything. That night the restaurant closed later than usual. A private dinner had stretched the staff thin, leaving everyone exhausted, irritable, and eager to go home. The kitchen, once filled with controlled chaos, now settled into a slower rhythm. Pots being scrubbed, surfaces wiped down, leftovers sorted with careless indifference. Busisiwe moved through the space quietly, her body heavy but her mind alert. Mr. Dlamini's warning still echoed in her ears, sharper now in the silence of closing time. "If I catch you again, you will lose this job." It wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. And Busisiwe understood exactly what that meant. She had seen what happened to others who lost their jobs. People didn't just disappear from the workplace. They disappeared from stability, from dignity, from the fragile sense of control over their own lives. One day you had something. The next, you had nothing. She could not afford that. Not now, not ever. Still, as she stood near the back counter, watching a tray of untouched grilled chicken being scraped into a black plastic bin, something inside her tightened painfully. The food was still warm, still fresh, still enough to feed more than one person. A young kitchen assistant dumped a basket of bread beside it, barely glancing at what he was throwing away. "To think people pay for this and don't even finish it," he muttered, shaking his head as he walked away. Busisiwe's fingers curled slightly at her sides. She looked around. Most of the staff were busy finishing their tasks. Thandi and Lerato were near the front, laughing over something on a phone screen. Mr. Dlamini had stepped out to take a call. For a brief moment, the space felt unguarded. And yet the tension in her chest remained, because this time it wasn't just about being careful. This time she had been warned. The risk was real. The consequence was immediate. She stepped closer to the bin, her eyes fixed on the food. Then she stopped. Her breath slowed. Her mind drifted uninvited but familiar. Back to a time she never spoke about, a time when she had stood on the other side of hunger. It had been years ago, but the memory remained sharp, untouched by time. She had been younger then, smaller, weaker, and hungrier than she had ever been in her life. She remembered the way her stomach had ached, not just with emptiness, but with a kind of pain that made her feel invisible, forgotten, like the world had no place for her. She had wandered the streets of Alexandra barefoot, her clothes worn thin, her eyes scanning for anything that could ease the burning inside her. But there was nothing, not until she met Mama Zola. The old woman had lived in a small, crumbling shack at the edge of the township. People rarely noticed her. Those who did often looked away. She was poor quiet and carried the kind of presence that made others uncomfortable. Not because of who she was, but because of what she represented. Survival. Busisiwe had been afraid to approach her at first, but Mama Zola had seen her. Truly seen her. "You look like you haven't eaten," the old woman had said gently, her voice soft but certain. Busisiwe hadn't responded. She had only nodded. Mama Zola had disappeared into her shack and returned with a small plate rice, a bit of stew. Nothing special. But to Busisiwe, it had been everything. "Eat, Mama Zola," had said, placing it in her hands. That night, Busisiwe had learned something she would carry with her forever. Kindness did not require abundance. It only required a heart willing to give. Back in the present, Busisiwe blinked, the memory fading, but its impact lingering. Her gaze returned to the bin, to the food, to the choice in front of her. Her heart began to beat faster. Not out of fear, but out of certainty. Because she knew something Mr. Dlamini did not. She knew what hunger felt like. She knew what it meant to be overlooked, dismissed, reduced to nothing more than a problem others didn't want to deal with. And she knew that somewhere at that very moment, someone else was feeling that same pain, waiting, hoping, just like she once had. Busisiwe took a slow step forward, then another. Her hands moved carefully, deliberately. She reached into the bin, not recklessly, but with intention, selecting only what was untouched, what was still clean, what still held value. She wrapped the food neatly, just as she always did. Every movement precise, every decision thoughtful. This was not desperation. This was purpose. Behind her, a faint sound echoed. Footsteps. Busisiwe froze. Her heart skipped. She didn't turn immediately. She didn't panic. She had learned long ago that panic drew attention. Instead, she finished tying the plastic bag, her movements steady despite the tension rising inside her. "Busisiwe." The voice was unmistakable. "Mr. Dlamini." Slowly she turned. He stood a few feet away. His arms crossed, his expression darker than she had ever seen before. His eyes dropped to the bag in her hands, then back to her face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, heavy, unforgiving. "I warned you," he said finally, his voice low but filled with controlled anger. Busisiwe swallowed. "I know, sir." Then why, he demanded, stepping closer. "Why would you risk everything for this?" His hand gestured sharply toward the bag. "To steal what does not belong to you." The word struck again. Steal. Busisiwe felt it, but this time, she did not let it settle. She lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes for the first time. And when she spoke, her voice was quiet, but unshaken. "It doesn't belong to anyone anymore," she said. "You were throwing it away. That is not your concern," he snapped. "You do not make decisions for this establishment." Busisiwe tightened her grip on the bag. Her heart pounded, but her voice remained steady. "With respect, sir, it becomes my concern when people outside are starving." Mr. Dlamini's expression hardened further. "This is not a charity," he said coldly. "This is a business, and they are human," Busisiwe replied softly. The words hung in the air, simple but powerful. For a brief second, something flickered in Mr. Dlamini's eyes. Something uncertain, but it vanished just as quickly. "You've made your choice," he said, his tone final. "Hand over your uniform tomorrow. You're done here." The world seemed to pause, not because of the words, but because of what they meant. Everything Busisiwe had feared, everything she had risked, it had happened. She had lost her job, the one thing standing between her and uncertainty, between her and the edge she had worked so hard to escape. And yet, she did not break. She did not plead. She did not apologize. Instead, she nodded slowly. "I understand." Mr. Dlamini seemed almost taken aback by her response. No argument, no tears, just acceptance. Busisiwe adjusted her grip on the bag. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the exit. Each step steady, each movement deliberate. Behind her, the restaurant remained exactly as it had been. Bright, controlled, untouched by the reality that existed beyond its walls. But outside was where the truth lived. The kind of truth that could not be ignored. As Busisiwe stepped into the cool night air, the weight of what had just happened settled around her. She had lost her job, her security, her stability. But she had not lost herself, and that mattered more than anything. She tightened her hold on the bag and began to walk, back toward the darkness, back toward the people who needed her, unaware that somewhere hidden in the shadows, a pair of eyes had witnessed everything, and what they had just seen was about to change everything. Not far from the restaurant entrance, partially concealed by the dim glow of a street lamp and the tinted glass of a parked luxury car, a man had been watching. Mr. Nkosi. He had not intended to stay that late. Originally, it had been just another business dinner, one of many that filled his calendar, one of many that blurred into each other. Deals, negotiations, measured smiles, controlled words. That was his world. Structured, predictable, profitable. But something had shifted tonight. At first, it was nothing more than curiosity. He had noticed Busisiwe before. How could he not? Not because she stood out, but because she didn't. In a place where everyone tried so hard to be seen, she moved like a shadow, unnoticed, yet always present. Efficient, silent, different. And then there were the whispers. Staff conversations were easy to overhear if one paid attention, and Mr. Nkosi always paid attention. "She's been taking food. She hides it. She's probably stealing more than we think." He had heard enough to form a quiet suspicion. In his world, people often wore masks. Kindness was often an act. Honesty, negotiable. He had built an empire by learning not to trust appearances. So when he saw Busisiwe being confronted by Mr. Dlamini earlier that evening, he didn't intervene. He observed, he listened, and he waited. Now as he sat in the back seat of his car, watching her step out into the night with that same small plastic bag, his instincts sharpened. There it was again. The evidence, the confirmation of everything he had heard. Or so he thought. "Sir, should we leave?" his driver asked from the front seat, glancing at him through the rearview mirror. Mr. Nkosi didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on Busisiwe as she began to walk away from the restaurant, her figure small against the vast city night. "No," he said finally, his voice calm but decisive. "Follow her." The driver hesitated for a brief second. "Follow her, sir, yes." There was no further explanation. There didn't need to be. The car engine hummed softly as it pulled away from the curb, maintaining a careful distance. Not too close, not too far, just enough to keep her in sight. Busisiwe walked with purpose, not hurried, not hesitant, as if she had walked this path 100 times before. Mr. Nkosi leaned slightly forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied her movements. He expected uncertainty. He expected caution. He expected someone who knew they were doing something wrong. But he saw none of that. There was no fear in her steps, no urgency to hide, only quiet determination. That unsettled him more than anything. The city around them began to change as they moved further from the bright lights of Santon. The polished buildings gave way to narrower streets. The traffic thinned. The air felt different, heavier, less refined. Eventually the car slowed. "Sir!" "This area," the driver murmured, his tone cautious. "I know where we are," Mr. Nkosi replied. "Alexandra." a place he had not visited in years. Not because he didn't know it existed, but because men like him rarely had reason to return. Busisiwe continued on foot, turning into smaller alleys, navigating the uneven roads with familiarity. The further she went, the more the surroundings revealed a different reality, one that stood in sharp contrast to the world she had just left behind. Corrugated metal shacks lined the narrow paths. Faint lights flickered from inside them. Children's voices echoed softly in the distance. Somewhere a radio played music distorted by static. Life here was raw, unfiltered, real. "Stop here," Mr. Nkosi said quietly. The car came to a halt. He stepped out, adjusting his coat as the cool night air wrapped around him. For a brief moment he stood still, taking in the surroundings. It had been a long time since he had felt this kind of silence. Not the silence of luxury, but the silence of survival. Ahead of him, Busisiwe kept walking. He followed, at a distance, careful not to be seen, careful not to interrupt whatever truth was about to unfold. She turned one final corner, then stopped. Mr. Nkosi slowed his steps, positioning himself just out of direct sight, his body partially hidden behind a rusted structure. And then he saw it. A small group had gathered. Children, 3, no 5 of them, thin, barefoot, wrapped in oversized clothing that did little to protect them from the night chill. An elderly woman sat on a low wooden crate, nearby, her posture fragile but her eyes alert. They were waiting. For her. Busisiwe approached them, her expression softening in a way Mr. Nkosi had never seen before. Not at the restaurant, not under the fluorescent lights. This was different. This was warmth. "You're late tonight," one of the children said, his voice small but teasing. Busisiwe smiled gently. "Work was busy. Did you bring something?" another asked, hope flickering in her eyes. Busisiwe knelt down, placing the plastic bag carefully on the ground. "I always do." Her voice carried a quiet certainty. She opened the bag, and what followed? Mr. Nkosi felt something inside him shift. Busisiwe didn't rush. She didn't throw the food around carelessly. She distributed it, carefully, equally, making sure each child received something, making sure the elderly woman was served first. "Eat slowly," she reminded them softly. "There will be more tomorrow." The children nodded eagerly, already beginning to eat, their small faces lighting up with relief and gratitude. One of them paused, looking up at her. "Aren't you eating?" Busisiwe shook her head, her smile gentle. "I'm not hungry." Mr. Nkosi felt his breath catch. He looked at the bag, then at the children, then back at her. There was nothing left. She had given everything away, every single piece. And yet, she looked at peace, not like someone who had just sacrificed, but like someone who had fulfilled something meaningful. The elderly woman reached out her hand, resting lightly on Busisiwe's arm. "May God bless you, child," she said quietly. Busisiwe lowered her head slightly. "He already has," she replied. The simplicity of those words struck harder than anything else. Mr. Nkosi stood there, unmoving, his thoughts unraveling. Everything he had assumed, everything he had believed, every judgment he had silently formed. It was all wrong. She wasn't stealing, she wasn't desperate, she wasn't selfish. She was giving, in a way that demanded no recognition, no reward, no acknowledgement. And for the first time in a very long time, Mr. Nkosi felt something unfamiliar. Not power, not control, but humility. He had spent years building an empire, accumulating wealth, making decisions that moved markets. And yet standing here watching a young woman give away what little she had, he realized something that unsettled him deeply. There were forms of wealth he had never truly understood, and Busisiwe possessed one of them, silently, powerfully, completely. He took a slow step back, retreating into the shadows. Because this moment, it wasn't his to interrupt, but it was one he would never forget. And as he returned to his car, his mind heavy with everything he had just witnessed, one thought remained clear. This story was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Mr. Nkosi did not speak for the rest of the drive. The city lights returned gradually as the car moved away from Alexandra, but something inside him refused to return with them. His driver glanced at him more than once through the rearview mirror, sensing the unusual silence, but said nothing. For years, Mr. Nkosi had been a man of certainty. He made decisions quickly, trusted his instincts, read people with precision. It was how he built his empire, by seeing what others missed, by acting when others hesitated. But tonight, he had been wrong. And not just slightly wrong, completely. The image of Busisiwe kneeling in that dimly lit alley refused to leave his mind. The way she had smiled, the way she had given everything away without hesitation, the way she had said, "He already has." It didn't make sense, not in the world he knew, because in his world, giving was strategic, kindness had conditions, and generosity often came with a name attached to it, a brand, a reputation, a carefully constructed image. But what he had seen tonight, that had none of those things. It was quiet, invisible, unrecognized, and yet powerful. Sir, the driver's voice gently broke through his thoughts. They had arrived. The Nkosi residence stood tall behind iron gates, its structure illuminated by soft golden lights. Security personnel moved with quiet efficiency, opening the gates as the car approached. Everything was exactly as it should be. Controlled, secure, predictable. But as Mr. Nkosi stepped out of the car, something felt different. For the first time in a long time. This place didn't feel like enough. He walked inside, slowly, his polished shoes echoing faintly against the marble floor. The house staff greeted him, but he barely acknowledged them. His mind was elsewhere, still in Alexandra, still in that alley, still watching a young woman give away everything she had. He loosened his tie, moving toward his study, a room filled with books, awards, and framed photographs that told the story of his success. Deals signed, partnerships formed, milestones achieved, proof of a life built on ambition. But tonight, those symbols felt distant. He poured himself a glass of water, not trusting his hands with anything stronger. Then he sat, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to think without distraction. Who is she? The question came uninvited, but it stayed, because the more he thought about it, the less Busisiwe fit into any category he understood. She worked in a place where she was invisible. She lived in a place most people avoided. She had nothing. And yet, she gave like someone who had everything. It unsettled him, not because it didn't make sense, but because it challenged everything he believed made sense. He reached for his phone, paused, then dialed. "Good evening, sir," a voice answered on the other end. Calm, professional, familiar. "Samuel, Mr. Nkosi said, I need you to look into someone for me." There was no hesitation. "Of course, sir. Who?" He leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting to the window. "Her name is Busisiwe. She works at the restaurant on Rivonia Road. I want to know everything." A brief silence. "Then understood, sir. I'll begin immediately." Mr. Nkosi ended the call, but the restlessness remained. Because information was only part of what he wanted. What he really needed was understanding. The next morning, Busisiwe woke before dawn, just as she always did. But everything had changed. The thin mattress beneath her felt harder, the air colder, the silence heavier. Because today, she had nowhere to go. For a few moments she lay still, staring at the ceiling of her small shack. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind not as something dramatic, but as something inevitable. She had known the risk. She had accepted it. And now, she was living with the consequence. Slowly, she sat up. Her body moved out of habit, but her routine no longer had a place. No uniform to put on. No long walk to Santon. No job waiting for her. Just uncertainty. She wrapped her scarf around her head, more out of comfort than necessity, and stepped outside. The township was already awake. People moved through narrow paths, voices rising, life continuing. Because in places like this, life did not pause for loss. It adapted. Busisiwe walked slowly, her steps less certain than usual, not because she regretted what she had done, but because she didn't know what came next. Still, one thing remained unchanged. The people, the children, the elderly woman, they would still be there, waiting, hungry. She couldn't bring them food today. That thought weighed on her more than losing her job, because for the first time in a long time, she had nothing to give. Back in Santon, the restaurant buzzed as usual. Customers came and went. Orders were placed, plates were served, but something felt different. "Have you noticed how quiet it is?" Lerato said, glancing around. Thandi shrugged. "It's always like this in the morning." "No, I mean her." Thandi paused, then smirked slightly. "Busisiwe. She's gone." There was no guilt in her voice, no hesitation, just fact. Mr. Dlamini fired her. She continued, caught her stealing again. Lerato nodded slowly, though something in her expression flickered uncertainty, perhaps. Well, I guess that was bound to happen. But the words didn't carry the same confidence as before, because even they knew there had been something different about Busisiwe, something they had never fully understood. By midday, Mr. Nkosi had received his answer. He sat in his office. Samuel's report opened before him. Simple, direct, devastating. Orphaned at a young age, raised in poverty. No criminal record, no history of misconduct. Consistently described as quiet, hard-working, and generous. He read the last word again. Generous. It felt insufficient, because what he had seen the night before was more than that. It was sacrifice. He closed the file slowly. "Where is she now?" he asked. Samuel didn't need clarification. "In Alexandra, sir. Same area as last night." Mr. Nkosi stood, decisively. "Prepare the car." There was no hesitation this time, no uncertainty, because some truths, once seen, could not be ignored. When Busisiwe returned to the alley that afternoon, the children ran toward her as they always did. But today was different. She had nothing in her hands. No bag, no food, just herself. "I'm sorry," she said softly, kneeling down. "Not today." The disappointment was immediate, but quiet, because they understood, more than most adults ever would. "It's okay," one of them said, though his voice was smaller than usual. Busisiwe forced a gentle smile. But inside, something ached, because for the first time, she felt powerless, and she hated that feeling. She hated knowing what hunger felt like and being unable to stop it. She lowered her gaze slightly, and in that moment, a shadow fell across the ground in front of her. Not threatening, not sudden, just present. Busisiwe looked up, and there he was, Mr. Nkosi, standing just a few feet away. No suit jacket this time, no distance, just a man, watching her, not with suspicion, not with judgment, but with something she did not expect, understanding. The children grew quiet. The alley held its breath, and Busisiwe felt her world shift once again, because whatever was about to happen next would change everything. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air in the narrow alley seemed to still, as if even the distant sounds of the township had paused to witness what was unfolding. The children who only moments ago had been shifting restlessly, now stood quietly, their curious eyes moving between Busisiwe and the unfamiliar man standing before her. Busisiwe slowly rose to her feet. Her first instinct was caution. Not fear, but awareness. Men like him did not belong here, and people like her did not cross paths with people like him without consequence. She brushed her hands lightly against her dress, a subtle gesture grounding herself. "Sir," she said softly, her tone respectful but guarded. Mr. Nkosi nodded once. Busisiwe. Hearing her name from his lips sent a small ripple through her chest. She had never told him who she was. Not at the restaurant. Not anywhere. "So how did he know I didn't expect to see you here?" she added carefully. "I imagine not," he replied. His voice was calm, measured, but there was something different in it now. Not the distant authority she had sensed in the restaurant. Something closer, more human. The children shifted slightly behind her. One of the younger ones tugged gently at her dress. "Who is he?" the child whispered. Busisiwe placed a reassuring hand on the child's shoulder. "It's okay," she murmured, but she wasn't entirely sure if it was. Mr. Nkosi took a slow step forward, careful not to appear imposing. "I owe you an apology," he said. The words landed unexpectedly. Busisiwe blinked. "An apology? Yes." He held her gaze, not with intensity, but with sincerity. "I thought I understood what you were doing," he continued. "I thought I had seen enough to judge." A faint tension moved through Busisiwe's shoulders. "And now?" she asked quietly. "Now I know I was wrong." The simplicity of the admission caught her off guard, because people rarely admitted when they were wrong, especially men like him. She studied him for a moment, searching for something: pride, defensiveness, hidden motives, but she found none. Only honesty. Still, honesty did not erase caution. "It doesn't change anything," she said gently. "I lost my job." Mr. Nkosi nodded. "I know." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Of course you do." There it was again. That quiet realization. He knew more than he should. "Why are you here?" she asked, this time more directly. Mr. Nkosi glanced briefly at the children, then back at her. "Because I saw something last night that I cannot ignore." Busisiwe said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence often revealed more than questions. "I followed you," he continued. "I watched what you did." The words could have sounded invasive. They could have sounded like an accusation. But they didn't. Not the way he said them. "I saw you give everything away," he added. A small pause. "You didn't keep anything for yourself." Busisiwe lowered her gaze for a moment. "It wasn't mine to keep," she said. Mr. Nkosi let out a slow breath. "That's where you're wrong." She looked up again. "No," she said calmly. "That's where you are." A faint flicker of something surprise perhaps crossed his face. But she continued. "If something is going to be thrown away, it already has no owner," she said. "It becomes a choice. Either it disappears, or it feeds someone." Her voice was not defensive, not emotional, just certain. "And you chose to feed others," he said. "Yes. Even when it cost you your job. Yes. No hesitation, no regret, just truth." Mr. Nkosi was silent for a moment, because in that simple exchange, he heard something he could not dismiss. Conviction. Not the kind that came from comfort, but the kind that was forged in experience. Why, he asked finally. The question lingered. Not accusatory, not skeptical, just searching. Busisiwe glanced at the children, then at the elderly woman sitting quietly nearby, then back at him. "Because I remember what it feels like," she said. Her voice softened slightly. "To be hungry, to be ignored, to feel like no one sees you." Mr. Nkosi's chest tightened. "I was there once," she continued, "and someone helped me. not because they had much, but because they chose to care. Mama Zola. The name didn't need to be spoken. It lived in her voice. In places like this, she added, gesturing lightly around them, we survive because someone decides we matter. The words settled deeply. Mr. Nkosi looked around for the first time, not as an observer but as someone trying to understand. The narrow space, the fragile structures, the quiet resilience. He had seen places like this before, but he had never truly seen them. Not like this. And now, Busisiwe said, her voice quieter, I have nothing to give them. That was the first crack, not in her strength, but in her situation. Mr. Nkosi noticed it immediately, and something inside him responded. You still have something, he said. She shook her head gently. No food, no job, no way to help. He took another step closer. Then let me help. The words hung in the air, heavy, unavoidable. Busisiwe's eyes searched his face again, this time more carefully. Because offers like that, they came with conditions, always. I don't need charity, she said slowly. Mr. Nkosi shook his head. This isn't charity. Then what is it? He paused, because the answer mattered, not just for her, but for him. It's correction, he said finally. She frowned slightly. I judged you, he continued. I allowed something good to be destroyed because I didn't understand it. A breath. And now I have the opportunity to fix that. Busisiwe remained still, listening. But more than that, he added, his voice lowering slightly. I see something in you that this city needs. Her expression shifted, not into trust, but into curiosity. What do you mean? Mr. Nkosi glanced at the children again, then back at her. You fed 5 people with leftovers, he said. What could you do if you had more? The question landed differently, not as pressure, but as possibility. Busisiwe hesitated, because she had never allowed herself to think that far. Her world had always been about the next meal, the next day, the next survival, not expansion, not impact, but now. For the first time, the idea existed. Still, she guarded herself. And what do you expect in return, she asked. Mr. Nkosi met her gaze. Nothing. The answer was immediate, uncomplicated, but she didn't believe it. Not yet. No one gives without expecting something, she said. He smiled faintly. Last night I watched someone do exactly that. Silence. Busisiwe felt the weight of his words, because he wasn't just speaking, he was reflecting, learning. And in that moment, something shifted between them. Not trust, not yet, but understanding. I won't force you, he said, and I won't decide for you. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a card, held it out. If you choose to walk away from this, I will respect that. She didn't take it immediately. If you choose to continue what you've started, he added, then call me. The alley remained quiet. The children watched. The world held its breath. Slowly, Busisiwe reached out and took the card, not as acceptance, but as a possibility, and sometimes that was enough to change everything. That night, Busisiwe did not sleep. The small shack that had always felt like a place of rest now felt too quiet, too full of thoughts that refused to settle. The card Mr. Nkosi had given her lay on the floor beside her mattress, untouched but impossible to ignore. She had picked it up more than once, turned it over, read the name again, Nkosi Holdings. Even without knowing the full extent of his power, she understood enough. Men like him did not simply offer help without the ability to change entire lives. And that was exactly what frightened her. Busisiwe had spent years learning how to survive without depending on anyone. Not because she didn't believe in people, but because she had learned how quickly circumstances could change, how easily help could disappear. how dangerous it was to build your life on something you did not control. She sat up slowly, pulling her thin blanket around her shoulders. The night air pressed in through the gaps in the metal walls, carrying distant sounds of laughter, arguments, and music. Life continued outside, indifferent to her thoughts. Her gaze dropped to the card again. What could you do? If you had more, Mr. Nkosi's words echoed softly in her mind. It wasn't the offer that stayed with her. It was the question. Because for the first time, someone had asked her to think beyond survival, beyond the next meal, beyond the next day, and she didn't know how to answer that. Her entire life had been shaped by limitation, by making the most out of almost nothing, by finding ways to give even when she barely had enough for herself. But more. What did more even look like? Her thoughts drifted again to Mama Zola. The small shack, the quiet voice, the simple meals. Mama Zola had never had more. And yet, she had changed everything for Busisiwe. Not through abundance, but through consistency, through presence, through love that didn't ask questions. Busisiwe closed her eyes briefly. Maybe more wasn't about having everything. Maybe it was about doing the same thing, on a bigger scale. Still doubt remained, because accepting help meant stepping into a world she did not understand. A world where intentions were often hidden behind polished words and expensive gestures. A world where people like her were often used, not supported. She lay back down slowly, but sleep still did not come, only the weight of a decision. The next morning arrived quietly. Busisiwe stepped outside as she always did, though there was no destination waiting for her. The sun rose over Alexandra, casting a soft glow over the uneven paths and crowded structures. Children ran past her. Women carried buckets of water. Men prepared for another day of work. And life moved forward, as if nothing had changed. But for Busisiwe, everything had. She walked toward the alley, her steps slow but familiar. The children were already there, waiting. Their eyes lifted when they saw her. Hope flickered, small, fragile, but present. "Did you bring something today?" one of them asked. Busisiwe hesitated, then shook her head gently. "Not today." The disappointment was quiet, respectful, because they understood, and that understanding hurt more than anything else. The elderly woman, Mama Zola's old friend, known simply as Gogo Nomza, watched from her usual spot. "You carry something heavier than hunger today," she said softly. Busisiwe looked at her. You can see that Gogo Nomza smiled faintly. "I have lived long enough to recognize when a heart is full of questions." Busisiwe sat down beside her. For a moment she said nothing. Then slowly, "Someone offered to help me," she admitted. Gogo Nomza nodded slightly as if she had expected this. "And you don't know if you should accept." "It wasn't a question." Busisiwe shook her head. "I don't know what it will cost." Gogo Nomza turned her gaze toward the children. "Everything in life has a cost," she said. "The question is, what are you willing to risk?" Busisiwe followed her gaze. The children sat quietly, their usual energy softened by the absence of food. "They depend on me," she said. "And you depend on what?" Gogo Nomza asked gently. The question lingered, because Busisiwe did not have an answer. She had always depended on herself. But now, that was no longer enough. "You cannot pour from an empty cup, child," Gogo Nomza continued. "Even the strongest hands need something to hold." Busisiwe lowered her gaze. Her fingers brushed lightly against the edge of her dress. "What if I lose myself?" she asked quietly. Gogo Nomza chuckled softly. "A person who fears losing themselves rarely does." Busisiwe looked up again. "You have already shown who you are," the old woman added. "That does not change because your circumstances do." The words settled deeply, because they didn't promise safety, they didn't remove risk, but they reminded her of something important. She was not defined by what she had. She was defined by what she chose to do with it, even if it became more. Later that afternoon, Busisiwe stood alone outside her shack. The card rested in her hand. This time she didn't hesitate. She looked at it once more, then took a breath, and dialed. The phone rang only once. Busisiwe. His voice was immediate, as if he had been expecting the call. She closed her eyes briefly, then spoke. "I have conditions." There was a pause, not of surprise, but of respect. "I'm listening," Mr. Nkosi replied. "This is not about me," she said. "If I do this, it's for them, I understand." "I don't want handouts," she continued. "I want something that lasts." "Agreed, and I will not lie for you. I will not pretend. I will not change who I am." Mr. Nkosi's voice softened slightly. "That is exactly why I came to you." Busisiwe opened her eyes. The tension in her chest eased, just a little. "Then I will meet you," she said, when he asked. She looked toward the alley, toward the children, toward the life she knew, today. An hour later, a black car pulled into Alexandra. Heads turned, whispers followed, because vehicles like that did not belong here. Mr. Nkosi stepped out, not as a distant observer this time, but as someone stepping into a reality he had chosen to face. Busisiwe approached him, her posture steady, her expression calm, no longer uncertain. "I'm ready," she said. Mr. Nkosi nodded. "So am I." Behind them, the children watched, unaware that this moment, this simple exchange, was the beginning of something far greater than any of them could imagine. Because sometimes, change does not arrive loudly. It begins quietly, with a choice, a conversation, a single step forward. And Busisiwe had just taken hers. The drive out of Alexandra felt longer than it actually was. Busisiwe sat quietly in the back seat of Mr. Nkosi's car, her hands folded gently in her lap, her posture composed but her thoughts restless. Through the tinted window she watched the township slowly fade into the distance, corrugated rooftops, narrow pathways, and the familiar rhythm of survival slipping behind her. In front of her, something unknown. Mr. Nkosi did not rush to speak. He had learned in the short time he had known her that Busisiwe was not someone who needed words to fill silence. She carried her thoughts carefully, revealing them only when they had meaning. So he waited, and eventually, she spoke. "I wasn't always this strong." Her voice was soft but steady. Mr. Nkosi turned slightly, giving her his full attention. "I didn't think you were," he said. Busisiwe allowed herself a faint, almost distant smile. "People always assume strength means you've never been broken," she continued. "But sometimes, it means you've been broken so many times you just learned how to stand again." The words settled between them. Not heavy, but real. "My parents died when I was very young," she said, her gaze drifting back to the window. "I don't remember much about them. Just fragments. My mother's voice, my father's laugh, a pause. After that, I moved between relatives, houses that were never really mine." Mr. Nkosi listened without interruption, because this was not a story to be guided. It was one to be received. "They fed me when they could," Busisiwe said. "But I was never a priority. Just another responsibility." Her fingers tightened slightly against each other. "There were days I didn't eat, days I learned to ignore hunger, days I learned that asking didn't always help." Mr. Nkosi felt something shift inside him. Not pity, something deeper, understanding. Because while his life had been different, struggle in its own form was something he recognized. "I left when I was old enough," she continued. "Or maybe when I had no other choice." The car slowed slightly as traffic thickened ahead, but neither of them noticed. "I didn't have a plan," she admitted. just the belief that somewhere I would survive. Her voice didn't carry regret, only truth. And then I met her. The shift in her tone was subtle, but unmistakable. "Who?" Mr. Nkosi asked gently. Busisiwe's expression softened. "Mama Zola." The name seemed to carry its own weight. "She lived in a place smaller than mine," Busisiwe said, "with less than I had. But she saw me." Her eyes lifted slightly as if seeing something beyond the present. "I didn't ask her for help," she added. "I didn't even speak. I just stood there." "And she understood?" Mr. Nkosi asked. Busisiwe nodded. "She didn't ask questions. She didn't judge. She just gave." Her voice dropped slightly. "Food, a place to sit, a moment of peace." Mr. Nkosi leaned back slightly, absorbing every word. "Why?" he asked. Busisiwe shook her head faintly. "I asked her that once," she said. "Do you know what she told me?" Mr. Nkosi waited. "She said, 'Because someone did it for me.'" The simplicity of it struck him. A chain, a quiet, invisible chain of kindness passed from one life to another. "She didn't have much," Busisiwe continued, "but she gave what she could, and she never made me feel like I owed her anything. A breath. She just made me feel human." The word lingered, because for someone who had been overlooked, dismissed, and forgotten, that was everything. "How long did you stay with her?" Mr. Nkosi asked. Busisiwe's expression shifted again. This time, heavier. "Not long enough." Silence followed, because some losses didn't need explanation. "She got sick," Busisiwe said quietly, "and there was no one to help her. No money, no treatment." Mr. Nkosi's jaw tightened slightly. He had seen that story before. "Too many times. I tried," Busisiwe added. "I did everything I could, but it wasn't enough." Her voice didn't break, but something inside it did. "She died the way she lived," she said, quietly, without asking for anything. The car fell into silence once more, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of everything she had shared. "And that's why you do this," Mr. Nkosi said softly. It wasn't a question. Busisiwe nodded. "She fed me when I had nothing," she said. "So I feed others when I can." Her gaze returned to him. "I don't do it because I have extra," she added. "I do it because I remember." The words settled deeply, because they carried something rare. Purpose without expectation. Giving without condition. Mr. Nkosi exhaled slowly. "I've spent my life building something," he said after a moment. "Companies, wealth, influence." Busisiwe listened. "But somewhere along the way," he continued, "I forgot what it was supposed to mean." Her expression didn't change, but her attention deepened. "I told myself I was helping people," he said, "creating jobs, supporting communities, and in some ways, I was." A pause. "But I also learned how to distance myself, how to see numbers instead of faces." He looked at her directly. "And then, I saw you." Busisiwe held his gaze. "And you reminded me," he finished. The honesty in his voice was unmistakable. Because this wasn't about charity. It wasn't about guilt. It was about recognition of something he had lost, and something she had never let go of. The car came to a stop. Busisiwe looked outside. The environment had changed again. Clean streets, tall buildings, a different world. She felt it immediately, not as discomfort, but as contrast. "Where are we?" she asked. Mr. Nkosi stepped out of the car, then opened her door. "My office," he said. Busisiwe hesitated for a brief moment, then stepped out, not as someone entering unfamiliar territory, but as someone carrying her own truth into it. As they walked toward the building, she glanced at him. "Why me?" she asked. Mr. Nkosi didn't answer immediately, because the answer mattered, not just to her, but to him. Finally, he spoke. Because you didn't stop being kind, even when it cost you everything. Busisiwe looked ahead. The building doors opened, and with them, a new chapter began. Not built on wealth alone, but on something far more powerful. A story that had started with hunger and was about to become something much greater. Because sometimes, the people who have the least are the ones who show the world what truly matters. The moment Busisiwe stepped inside Mr. Nkosi's office building, she felt the shift. It wasn't just the temperature-controlled air or the polished marble floors that reflected light like still water. It was the atmosphere, controlled, efficient, deliberate. People moved with purpose. Here, their steps measured their voices, low but confident. Everything functioned as if guided by an invisible order. It was a world Busisiwe had only ever observed from a distance. Now, she was standing in it. But she did not shrink. She did not stare in awe or hesitate in uncertainty. She walked beside Mr. Nkosi with the same quiet composure she carried everywhere else. Because she understood something that no building, no matter how grand, could change. Her value did not come from where she stood. It came from who she was. Mr. Nkosi noticed that immediately. Most people, when brought into spaces like this for the first time, revealed themselves quickly. Some became smaller, overwhelmed by the difference. Others tried too hard, masking insecurity with false confidence. But Busisiwe, she remained exactly the same, and that confirmed what he had already begun to believe. She was not someone shaped by her environment. She was someone who shaped meaning within it. They entered a private conference room overlooking the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed Johannesburg in all its contrast, wealth and struggle, existing side by side, separated not by distance, but by circumstance. Mr. Nkosi gestured for her to sit. She did. No hesitation, no uncertainty, just presence. "I want to understand your vision," he said, taking a seat across from her. Busisiwe looked at him for a moment. "My vision," she repeated. "Yes," he said. "If we do this, it cannot just be about feeding a few people for a few days. It has to be something that continues, something that grows." Busisiwe nodded slowly. I agree." "Then tell me," he continued, "what does that look like to you?" For a moment she was silent. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because she had never been asked to define it. Her actions had always spoken for her. Now, she had to put them into words. "It starts small," she said, finally. Mr. Nkosi leaned back slightly, listening. "A place where people know they can come without being turned away," she continued. "Not just for food, but for dignity." The word hung in the air. Dignity. It wasn't something most people associated with charity. But Busisiwe did. "No lines that make people feel ashamed," she added. "No questions that make them feel like they have to prove they deserve to eat." Mr. Nkosi's expression shifted. Because this was not just about feeding people. It was about restoring something deeper. And the food, he asked. "We use what others waste," she said. "But we also build something of our own. A kitchen, a system, something that doesn't depend on leftovers alone." She paused briefly. "And eventually, we teach others to do the same." Mr. Nkosi's eyes narrowed slightly, not in doubt but in focus. "You're thinking beyond survival," he said. Busisiwe nodded. "Survival is temporary," she replied. "If we stop there, nothing changes." Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with realization. Because in that moment, Mr. Nkosi understood something clearly. Busisiwe wasn't just kind. She was capable of building something meaningful, something sustainable, something that could outlast both of them. "What would you call it?" he asked. Busisiwe didn't hesitate this time. "Mama Zola." The name settled into the room with quiet power. Mr. Nkosi nodded slowly. "A legacy," he said. "Yes," Busisiwe replied. "One that continues what she started." He stood, walked to the window, looked out over the city, then turned back. "Then we build it," he said. The words were simple, but their impact was not. Busisiwe felt it, not as excitement, but as responsibility. Because this wasn't just an opportunity, it was a promise. The process began immediately. Mr. Nkosi moved with efficiency, but not control. That was the difference. He did not take over. He supported. Meetings were arranged. Spaces were reviewed. Plans were drawn. But Busisiwe was present in every decision, not as a figurehead, but as a voice. "What about this location?" one of the architects asked, pointing to a map. Busisiwe studied it carefully. "It's too far from where people actually need it," she said. "They won't come here." The man nodded, making notes. "Another meeting." "What kind of system do we implement for distribution?" a consultant asked. Busisiwe shook her head slightly. "No system that makes people feel like they're being processed," she said. "It has to feel human." Mr. Nkosi watched quietly. Because this was leadership. Not loud, not forceful, but clear, grounded, authentic, and, slowly, the idea began to take shape. A space in Alexandra, accessible, open, welcoming, a kitchen that would operate daily. Not just serving food, but creating connection, a place where people were seen. Not managed, but not everyone supported it. Back at the restaurant, whispers had turned into conversations. "Did you hear?" Lerato said, her voice filled with disbelief. "That girl." Busisiwe Thandi rolled her eyes. "What about her? She's working with Mr. Nkosi now." Silence, then a laugh. "That's impossible. I'm serious," Lerato insisted. "I saw them together." Thandi's expression shifted, not into shock, but something else, unease. "People like her don't just rise like that," she said. But even as she spoke, something in her voice faltered. Because deep down, she knew Busisiwe had never been like them. Weeks passed, and the transformation became visible. The space in Alexandra changed. Walls were repaired, equipment installed. People began to gather not just out of need, but out of curiosity. And at the center of it all was Busisiwe. Not in front, not above, but among, serving, organizing, listening. Mr. Nkosi visited often, not as a businessman, but as someone learning. Because every day, he saw something he could not measure. Impact, real, immediate, unfiltered, and for the first time in years, he felt something his success had never given him. Purpose. One afternoon, as Busisiwe stood at the entrance of the newly opened kitchen watching children eat with full plates and quiet smiles, Mr. Nkosi approached her. "You were right," he said. She glanced at him. "About what this?" He gestured around them. "It's more than food." Busisiwe nodded. It always was. He looked at her. "You didn't just change their lives," he said. She raised an eyebrow slightly. "No." He shook his head. "You changed mine." Busisiwe didn't respond immediately, because some truths didn't need acknowledgement. They just needed to be lived. And as the sun dipped lower over Alexandra, casting warm light over a place that once held only struggle, something new had taken root. Not just a kitchen, not just a project, but a beginning. One built not on wealth alone, but on memory, on purpose, on a promise kept. And this time, it was only going to grow. Success, even when quiet, rarely goes unnoticed. And in places where people had once felt comfortable judging Busisiwe, her sudden transformation became a source of discomfort they did not know how to handle. At the restaurant, her absence had created a space, but not the kind they expected. For a few days, things continued as usual. Plates were served, customers came and went, and the rhythm of the business remained intact. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Busisiwe was no longer there to ignore. And without her quiet presence, the conversations changed. She really thinks she's something now, Thandi muttered one afternoon, folding napkins with sharper movements than necessary. Lerato leaned closer, lowering her voice. You've seen the pictures, right? Thandi frowned. What pictures? Online, Lerato said, pulling out her phone. People are posting about that kitchen in Alexandra. They're calling it something Mama Zola. The name alone was enough to make Thandi's jaw tighten. Lerato scrolled quickly, then turned the screen toward her. There it was, Busisiwe, standing beside a group of children holding a tray of food. Her expression calm, her presence undeniable. Behind her, the small kitchen space buzzed with life. And beside her, Mr. Nkosi. Thandi's lips pressed into a thin line. That doesn't mean anything, she said quickly. People take pictures all the time. But her voice lacked conviction, because this was not just a picture. It was proof. Proof that the girl they had mocked had not disappeared. She had risen, and not quietly. Customers are talking about it, Lerato added. Even some of the staff. They're saying she wasn't stealing, that she was helping people. The words landed like a challenge. Because if that was true, then what did that make them? Thandi looked away. I don't care what people are saying, she replied, though her tone had sharpened. We know what we saw, did they? The question lingered unspoken but present. Meanwhile, in Alexandra, the Mama Zola kitchen continued to grow. More people came each day, not just for food but for connection. Volunteers began to appear, some from the township, others from outside. People who had heard the story. People who wanted to be part of something real. Busisiwe welcomed them all. But she remained careful, because growth brought attention. And attention brought risk. One afternoon, as she organized supplies in the back of the kitchen, Gogo Nomza approached her. You are being watched, the old woman said quietly. Busisiwe looked up. I know, she replied. Gogo Nomza studied her. And you are not afraid? Busisiwe paused, then shook her head slightly. I am careful, she said, but not afraid. The distinction mattered, because fear could stop her, but awareness, that kept her grounded. Back in Santon, Mr. Nkosi sat in his office, reviewing reports. The Mama Zola initiative had already begun to attract media attention. Small articles, social media posts, word spreading beyond Alexandra. It was growing faster than expected, but with that growth came complications. A knock sounded at his door. Come in, he said. Samuel entered, his expression more serious than usual. Sir, he began. There's something you should see. He placed a file on the desk. Mr. Nkosi opened it. His eyes moved quickly over the contents, then slowed, then hardened. What is this? He asked. A complaint, Samuel replied. Filed anonymously, but we have reason to believe it originated from someone connected to the restaurant. Mr. Nkosi's gaze lifted. Go on. They're accusing Busisiwe of misusing funds, Samuel continued, claiming that the kitchen is a front, that donations are not being properly accounted for. Silence, but not the kind that passed, the kind that built. Is there any truth to it? Mr. Nkosi asked. Samuel shook his head immediately. None. We've reviewed all transactions. Everything is transparent. Mr. Nkosi closed the file slowly. But the accusation exists, he said. Yes, and once it exists, he continued, it spreads. Samuel nodded. That's the concern. Mr. Nkosi leaned back slightly, his mind already moving ahead, because he understood something very clearly. Truth alone was not always enough. Perception mattered, and once doubt was introduced, it could grow. That evening, Busisiwe noticed the change, not in the people who came to eat, but in the way some of them looked at her, not with distrust, but with hesitation, small, subtle, but present. A woman approached her near the serving area. I heard something she said quietly. Busisiwe met her gaze. "What did you hear?" The woman hesitated. "People are saying, 'You're not being honest about the money.'" The words landed, not as a surprise, but as confirmation, because Busisiwe had expected this, not from everyone, but from somewhere. "Do you believe that?" Busisiwe asked gently. The woman shook her head quickly. "No, but others might." Busisiwe nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me." The woman left, but the weight remained. Because this was different. Not mockery, not dismissal, but doubt. And doubt could destroy everything she had built. Later that night, Mr. Nkosi arrived. He didn't wait. He didn't observe from a distance. He walked straight to her. "You've heard," he said. Busisiwe nodded. "I have," and she looked at him. Calm, steady. "Then we show them the truth." Mr. Nkosi studied her, because he expected frustration, anger, defensiveness. But she showed none of it. "They're trying to break what we built," he said. Busisiwe shook her head slightly. "No," she replied. "They're testing it." The difference was subtle, but powerful. "And if it's real," she continued, "it won't break." Mr. Nkosi exhaled slowly, because once again, she saw something he didn't, not just the problem, but the path through it. "What do you need?" he asked. Busisiwe didn't hesitate. "Transparency," she said. "Open everything, every record, every transaction." He nodded, and she looked around. At the people, at the space, at the same time. "We keep going," she added. "We don't stop, because stopping would mean doubt had won." Mr. Nkosi allowed a faint smile. "Good," he said. "Why?" she asked. "Because I was about to suggest the same thing." For the first time since the accusation surfaced, the tension eased, not because the problem was gone, but because they had chosen how to face it, together. Across the city, the whispers continued, but something else began to happen. The truth started to speak. Volunteers shared their experiences. Records were made public, people who had eaten, who had been helped, who had seen the work firsthand. They spoke, and slowly, the doubt began to shift, not disappear, but weaken, because lies could only grow in silence, and Busisiwe had refused to stay silent. One evening, as she stood outside the kitchen watching the last group of people leave with full stomachs and quiet gratitude, she felt it. Not victory, not relief, but strength, because she had faced something new, not hunger, not poverty, but reputation, and she had not let it define her. Mr. Nkosi joined her. "They underestimated you," he said. Busisiwe shook her head. "They didn't understand me," she replied. He looked at her, and now she allowed a small smile. "Now, they're starting to." The city around them remained the same, but something within it had changed, because sometimes the greatest battles are not fought in public. They are fought in perception, in truth, in the quiet decision to stand firm, even when others try to shake your foundation. And Busisiwe was not going anywhere. The following week, Mr. Nkosi did something few powerful men chose to do when faced with quiet attacks. He did not hide. He made everything visible. A public gathering was announced at the Mama Zola kitchen. Not a press conference filled with distant speeches, but an open day, an invitation to anyone who wanted to see, ask, and understand. Word spread quickly. Curiosity brought people. So did doubt, and so did those who had been waiting for a reason to believe. By midday, the narrow streets of Alexandra buzzed with movement. Residents gathered in small clusters, volunteers moved in and out of the kitchen, and a few journalists, drawn by the growing story, stood near the entrance cameras ready. Busisiwe stood at the center of it all. Not elevated, not hidden, present, calm, ready. Mr. Nkosi arrived shortly after, not with an entourage meant to impress, but with quiet intention. He greeted people as he entered his presence, noticeable but not overpowering. Because today was not about him. It was about truth, and truth needed to be seen, not announced. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly as he approached Busisiwe. She nodded. "I've been ready," she replied. There was no tension in her voice, no anxiety, only clarity. Mr. Nkosi gave a small nod, then turned toward the gathered crowd. "Thank you for coming," he began, his voice steady, carrying easily without force. "We've heard concerns, questions, accusations." He paused briefly. "And today, we answer them." There were no dramatic gestures, no defensive tone, just openness. He stepped aside slightly. "This is Busisiwe," he said, "and everything you see here exists because she chose to act when others chose to ignore." A murmur moved through the crowd. Some faces curious, some skeptical, some already convinced. Busisiwe stepped forward, not as someone defending herself, but as someone sharing her truth. "We keep records of everything," she said simply. "Every donation, every expense, every meal." She gestured toward a table set up nearby. Ledgers, receipts, printed reports, accessible, clear. "If anyone wants to see, you can," she added. No hesitation, no conditions, just transparency. A man stepped forward from the crowd. "What about the claims?" he asked. "That money is being used for something else." Busisiwe met his gaze. "If that were true," she said calmly, "it would be written somewhere. Because nothing here is hidden." She motioned toward the records again. "Check for yourself." The man hesitated, then stepped closer, and began to look. Others followed, one by one. Because doubt demands evidence, and Busisiwe had nothing to hide. Across the space, whispers shifted. Not louder, but different. They're really showing everything. "Look at this. It's all there. There's nothing missing." Even the journalists moved closer, their attention sharpening. Because this was not the story they expected. There was no scandal to uncover, no contradiction to expose, only consistency, only truth. At the edge of the gathering, two familiar faces stood, Thandi and Lerato. They had come quietly, not announced, not invited, drawn by something they could not ignore. Thandi's arms were crossed tightly, her expression guarded, but her eyes, they moved, observing, processing. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered. Lerato didn't respond immediately. Because for the first time, she wasn't sure what to say. They watched as people approached Busisiwe, not with suspicion but with gratitude. A mother holding a child, an elderly man leaning on a cane. Volunteers speaking about what they had seen, what they had experienced. "This place helped me when I had nothing," one woman said to a reporter. She didn't ask questions. She just helped. Lerato swallowed slowly, because those words, they didn't match the image she had built. Thandi shifted uncomfortably. "They're just saying that because it looks good," she insisted. But her voice lacked strength, because deep down, she knew this wasn't performance, this was real. At the center, Busisiwe continued to move through the crowd, answering questions, listening, explaining, not as someone defending a reputation, but as someone sharing a purpose. A young journalist approached her. "Why didn't you respond earlier?" he asked. When the accusations first appeared, Busisiwe paused, then smiled slightly. "Because truth doesn't need to rush," she said. "It only needs to stand." The words lingered, captured, shared, and in that moment, something shifted, not just in perception, but in understanding. Mr. Nkosi watched from a distance, not because he wasn't involved, but because he understood something important. This was her moment, not his, and she was handling it with a strength that could not be taught, only lived. Samuel stepped beside him. "They're starting to turn," he said quietly. Mr. Nkosi nodded. "They already have," he replied, because the truth was no longer hidden. It was visible, and once seen, it could not be unseen. As the afternoon moved forward, the atmosphere changed. The tension that had once filled the space dissolved, replaced by something else. Respect, not loud, not declared, but present. And among those who felt it most deeply were the ones who had once doubted her the most. Thandi took a slow step forward, then another, until she stood just a few feet away from Busisiwe. Busisiwe noticed her, but did not react. Not with anger, not with distance, just acknowledgement. Thandi hesitated. Her words caught somewhere between pride and truth. Finally, "I was wrong," she said. The admission was quiet, but it carried weight. Busisiwe held her gaze, then nodded once. "I know," she replied. No accusation, no reminder, just acceptance. Lerato stepped forward as well. "I didn't understand," she added. Busisiwe's expression softened slightly. "You didn't try to," she said. The words were not harsh, just honest. And sometimes, honesty was enough. As the sun began to lower, casting warm light over the kitchen, the crowd slowly began to disperse. But something remained. Not the doubt, not the accusations, but the impact, because what had been questioned had now been proven. Not through argument, but through openness, through consistency, through truth. Mr. Nkosi approached Busisiwe once more. "You handled that better than I ever could have," he said. She shook her head slightly. "No," she replied. "I just didn't hide." He smiled faintly. Most people would have. Busisiwe looked around, at the space, at the people, at everything that had been built. "Then most people forget what this is about," she said. Mr. Nkosi followed her gaze and understood. Because this was never about proving others wrong. It was about continuing to do what was right. No matter who watched, no matter who doubted, no matter who spoke. And in that quiet understanding, something powerful settled. Because Busisiwe had faced something that could have broken her. And instead, she had strengthened everything around her. Not by fighting louder, but by standing clearer. And, sometimes, that was the strongest response of all. After the crowd dispersed, the Mamazola kitchen did not return to silence. It returned to life. Not the uncertain, fragile kind that had existed before, but something steadier now, something grounded. The doubts that had once hovered in the air were gone, replaced by quiet trust. People moved with ease again. Volunteers worked with renewed energy. The children laughed louder, freer, as if they too had felt the shift. But not everyone found peace so easily. At the edge of the space, Thandi remained. She had not left with the others. Lerato stood beside her, though her posture was less tense, her expression softer, more reflective than defensive. Thandi's arms were no longer crossed. They hung at her sides, uncertain, because for the first time since all of this had begun, she didn't know where to stand. "I didn't think it would be like this," she murmured. Lerato glanced at her. Like what Real Thandi admitted, the word felt strange in her mouth, because everything she had believed about Busisiwe had been built on assumptions, quick judgments, careless observations, and the comfort of thinking she understood someone without ever truly looking. Now standing there watching people eat, talk, smile, she realized how wrong she had been, and that realization, it wasn't easy. Lerato exhaled slowly. "We should go," she said quietly, but Thandi didn't move, not yet, because leaving would be easier, and something inside her told her she didn't deserve easy. Across the kitchen, Busisiwe continued her work. not because she needed to prove anything anymore, but because this was what she did, what she had always done. She moved between people, checking on portions, making sure no one was left out, offering quiet words where needed. There was no change in her behavior, no pride, no visible relief, because her purpose had never depended on approval. Mr. Nkosi observed from a distance once more, but this time his gaze lingered, not on Busisiwe alone. It shifted, toward the ones watching her, toward the ones learning, toward the ones changing, because transformation was not limited to one person. It spread, quietly, powerfully. Finally, Thandi stepped forward. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because the distance was long, but because the weight she carried was unfamiliar. Regret. She approached slowly, stopped a few feet away. Busisiwe turned, their eyes met, and for a moment, time seemed to stretch, not in tension, but in recognition, of everything that had been, and everything that now stood between them. Thandi swallowed. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than Busisiwe had ever heard it. "I don't know where to start." Busisiwe didn't respond immediately. She simply waited, because some words needed space to find their way out. "I judged you," Thandi continued, "from the beginning. No denial, no justification, just truth. I thought I understood who you were," she added, "but I never asked. I never looked beyond what I wanted to see." Busisiwe listened, her expression calm, unmoved by emotion but not closed. "I said things," Thandi went on, her voice tightening slightly. "I let others believe things. I didn't stop it. A pause. I helped create it. That part cost her the most to say, because it removed distance, removed blame, placed responsibility where it belonged. On her. Lerato stepped closer as well. "I did too," she said softly. "I followed her lead. I didn't question it." Busisiwe glanced between them, then lowered her gaze briefly, not in dismissal, but in thought. Because forgiveness was not something she gave lightly, not because she held on to anger, but because she understood its weight. "You didn't know me," she said finally. Her voice was steady, simple, but not dismissive. Thandi nodded quickly. "That's true, but you chose not to," Busisiwe added. The words landed, not harsh but precise, because they separated ignorance from decision. Thandi's shoulders dropped slightly. "I know," she said. Silence followed, not uncomfortable, but necessary, because this moment was not about rushing to resolution. It was about facing truth, fully, and then Busisiwe stepped closer, not enough to close the distance completely, but enough to change it. "What matters now," she said, "is what you choose next." Thandi looked up, surprised, because she had expected rejection, distance, maybe even anger, but not this, not a choice. "What do you mean?" she asked. Busisiwe gestured lightly around them. "This place doesn't exist because people are perfect," she said. "It exists because people decide to do better." The words settled deeply, because they didn't erase what had happened, but they offered something else, a path forward. "If you want to help," Busisiwe continued, "then help. No conditions, no punishment, just opportunity." Thandi blinked. "You would." Allow that. Busisiwe met her gaze. "I don't own kindness," she replied. "I just choose it." That answer, it broke something, not in pain, but in release. Because forgiveness, when real, didn't come as a reward. It came as a responsibility. Lerato stepped forward first. "I want to help," she said. Not as a statement, but as a commitment. Busisiwe nodded once. "Then start today. Simple, immediate, real." Thandi hesitated, but only for a moment. Then she stepped forward too. "I do too." And just like that, the line that had once divided them shifted, not erased, but transformed. Later that evening, as the kitchen settled into a quieter rhythm, Mr. Nkosi approached Busisiwe. "You gave them a chance," he said. She nodded. "Yes, most people wouldn't." Busisiwe glanced toward where Thandi and Lerato now worked awkwardly at first, but sincerely. "They didn't understand," she said. "And now they're learning." Mr. Nkosi studied her. "Doesn't it bother you?" he asked. "What they did?" Busisiwe was silent for a moment. Then she spoke. "Pain doesn't disappear because you ignore it," she said. "But it also doesn't grow if you don't feed it." He considered that, because it was not the kind of answer he expected. It was not emotional, not reactive. It was grounded. "And forgiveness?" he asked. Busisiwe looked at him. "Forgiveness isn't for them," she said. "It's for me." The words lingered, because they carried something powerful. Freedom, not from what had happened, but from being defined by it. As the sun finally disappeared beyond the horizon, casting the kitchen in soft evening light, something undeniable settled into the space. Not just growth, not just success, but transformation. Because what had begun as a simple act of giving had become something far greater. A place where people didn't just receive help, they became part of it. A place where mistakes were not the end, but the beginning of something better. And at the center of it all was Busisiwe. Not as a leader who stood above others, but as someone who walked beside them, guiding, not through control, but through example. Because true strength was not in rising alone, it was in lifting others, even those who once stood against you, and that was a power no one could take away. What began as a single act of quiet kindness had now grown into something no one could ignore. The Mamazola kitchen was no longer just a small space in Alexandra. It had become a movement. Every morning before the sun fully rose, people were already gathering not out of desperation alone, but out of belief. Volunteers arrived early to prepare meals. Local vendors began donating ingredients. Even nearby businesses, once distant and indifferent, started contributing in small but meaningful ways. And at the center of it all, Busisiwe remained the same. She still arrived early, still worked alongside everyone else, still served food with her own hands. Because for her growth did not mean distance, it meant responsibility. One morning, as she stood outside the kitchen watching a group of children laugh over their breakfast, Mr. Nkosi approached her with a different kind of energy. Not the calm observation he usually carried, but something closer to excitement. "We've received requests," he said. Busisiwe turned to him. Requests, he nodded. From other communities, he explained. Soweto, Tembisa, even parts of Durban. She frowned slightly. "They want to visit." "No," he said. "They want to build what you built." The words settled. Not as pride, but as weight. Because this was no longer just about Alexandra. It was spreading. Busisiwe looked back at the kitchen, at the people, at everything that had been created through effort, trust, and consistency. "It's not something you can copy," she said. Mr. Nkosi tilted his head slightly. "Why not?" "Because it's not just a kitchen," she replied. "It's how people treat each other inside it." He considered that. Because she was right. The structure could be replicated. The funding could be provided. But the spirit, that was something else. And yet he said, "They're asking you to show them." Busisiwe was silent for a moment. Because the idea of expanding, it carried risk. Growth could strengthen something, but it could also weaken it. "If we move too fast," she said, "we lose what makes it real." Mr. Nkosi nodded. "I agree, so we don't move fast," she added. A faint smile appeared on his face. "We move right." That was the difference between them. He saw opportunity, she saw responsibility, and, together, they found balance. Within weeks, the first steps toward expansion began. Not with large announcements, not with immediate construction, but with conversations. Busisiwe traveled reluctantly at first to nearby communities, not as a figure of success but as someone listening. She sat with local leaders, spoke with families, observed the realities of each place. Because she understood something important. What worked in Alexandra would not automatically work everywhere else. Each community had its own needs, its own challenges, its own rhythm. And if Mama Zola was to grow, it had to respect that. In Soweto, she met a group of women already feeding children from their own kitchens. They had no structure, no support, but they had heart. Busisiwe didn't replace them. She supported them, helped them organize, connected them with resources, but most importantly, she listened. "This is not mine," she told them. "It's yours." And in that moment, something powerful happened. Ownership, because people did not feel like they were receiving help. They felt like they were building something. Back in Alexandra, the original kitchen continued to thrive. But with growth came attention, and with attention came expectations. One afternoon, a group of investors approached Mr. Nkosi. They had seen the impact, the media coverage, the momentum, and they saw opportunity. "This could be scaled," one of them said during a meeting. "Turn it into a national initiative, brand it, structure it." Mr. Nkosi listened, calm, measured. "And what happens to the people?" he asked. The man blinked. "What do you mean?" Mr. Nkosi leaned forward slightly. "Do they become part of it, or do they become part of the image silence?" Because the answer was not simple. "We can make this bigger," the investor insisted. "Faster, more efficient." Mr. Nkosi nodded slowly. "I don't doubt that," he said. A pause. But bigger is not always better. Because he had learned something, not from business, but from Busisiwe. That impact could not be rushed, and purpose could not be manufactured. Later that evening, he spoke to her about it. "They want to scale it," he said. Busisiwe didn't react immediately. How, she asked? National partnerships, branding, expansion at a much larger level. She nodded slowly. "And what do you think?" Mr. Nkosi looked at her. "I think they see what this is," he said, "but they don't understand how it became this." Busisiwe allowed a small smile. "They want results," she said. "Yes, and we want meaning." The distinction was clear, and it mattered. "We can grow," she added. "But not like that." Mr. Nkosi nodded. "I thought you'd say that." Because by now, he understood her, not just her actions, but her principles. And those principles were what made everything work. As the months passed, Mama Zola expanded carefully. One community at a time, one relationship at a time. No shortcuts, no compromises, and with each new location, the same pattern emerged. Not perfection, but connection. Not charity, but dignity. Not control, but shared purpose. One afternoon, as Busisiwe stood in a newly opened kitchen in Soweto, watching a group of volunteers serve meals to a long line of families, she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel before. Pride, not in herself, but in what had been created, not by her alone, but through her. She turned to Mr. Nkosi, who stood beside her. "It's bigger than I imagined," she said quietly. He nodded. "But still yours," he replied. Busisiwe shook her head. "No," she said, "it was never mine." She looked around, at the people, at the movement. "It belongs to anyone who chooses to continue it." Mr. Nkosi smiled. Because that was legacy. Not something owned, but something shared. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the growing network of kitchens, one truth became clear. This was no longer just a story of a girl who fed others with leftovers. It was a story of transformation, of purpose, of what happens when one act of kindness refuses to stop. And in that moment, Busisiwe understood something deeply. Mama Zola had not just fed her. She had started something, and now, that something would never end. Years passed, not in silence, but in growth. What had once been a small kitchen in Alexandra had now become something far greater than anyone could have imagined. Mama Zola was no longer just a name whispered in one community. It had spread carefully, intentionally, across cities, across provinces, carried not by marketing but by people. Each location looked different. Some were built from refurbished buildings. Others operated out of churches, schools, or even open courtyards. But they all carried the same spirit. No one turned away. No one questioned. No one made to feel small for needing help. And at the heart of it all, Busisiwe remained unchanged. She still visited Alexandra often, still served food with her own hands, still knelt to speak to children at eye level, because no matter how far the movement had grown, that place remained her beginning. One afternoon, as she walked through the original kitchen, now expanded but still familiar, she noticed a young girl standing near the entrance. The girl couldn't have been more than 8 years old, thin, quiet, her eyes scanning the room the same way Busisiwe's once had, carefully, cautiously, as if unsure whether she was allowed to be there. Busisiwe recognized that look instantly. She had worn it herself. She approached slowly, not to startle her, but to meet her. "You can come in," she said gently. The girl hesitated, then stepped forward. "Are you hungry?" Busisiwe asked. The girl nodded. Busisiwe knelt slightly, lowering herself to her level. "What's your name, Lindiwe?" the girl whispered. Busisiwe smiled softly. "I'm Busisiwe." The girl looked at her for a moment, then asked almost uncertainly, "Can I stay?" The question carried more than it seemed. Not just a request for food, but for safety, for belonging, for permission to exist without fear. Busisiwe's expression softened further. "You can stay as long as you need," she said. And just like that, something shifted. Not in the world, but in one life, and sometimes that was enough. Across the room, Mr. Nkosi watched the interaction quietly. He had aged, but not in a way that weakened him, in a way that deepened him. The sharp edges of ambition had softened, replaced by something steadier, something grounded, purpose. He walked over, slowly standing beside Busisiwe as she guided Lindiwe toward the serving area. "She reminds you of someone," he said. Busisiwe didn't look at him. "Yes," she replied. He nodded. "I can see that." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the girl receive a plate of food, her small hands holding it carefully, as if it were something fragile, something valuable. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if no one had helped you?" Mr. Nkosi asked. Busisiwe took a slow breath. "Yes," and she looked at him. "I don't stay there," she said. He understood. Because some questions were not meant to be lived in, only acknowledged. Later that evening, a small gathering was held. Not for celebration, but for reflection. Volunteers, community leaders, and people whose lives had been touched by Mama Zola gathered together. Not to speak about success, but to share stories. A man stood up first. "This place saved me," he said simply. Not just with food, but with dignity. A woman followed. "I came here when I had nothing," she said. "Now I volunteer every week." One by one, voices filled the space. Different stories, same truth, impact, real, lasting. And then they asked Busisiwe to speak. She stood slowly, not because she was nervous, but because she understood the weight of the moment. She looked around, at the people, at the space, at everything that had grown from something so small. "I didn't start this," she said. The room quieted. "I was just part of it." She paused. "Someone fed me when I had nothing," she continued, "and I chose not to forget." Her voice was steady, clear. "This is what happens when we don't forget, The simplicity of it. It carried everything. No long speech, no complex explanation. Just truth. And, sometimes, that was all that was needed. After the gathering, as the space slowly emptied, Mr. Nkosi approached her one last time. "You've built something extraordinary," he said. Busisiwe shook her head gently. "No," she replied. "We did." He smiled. "Fair enough. A pause. But you started it." She looked at him. "No," she said again. "Mama Zola did." And in that moment, he understood. Because legacy was not about ownership. It was about continuation. As the night settled over Alexandra, the kitchen lights dimmed slightly, but not completely. There was always someone arriving late, someone in need, someone searching, and the doors. They remained open, just as they always had, just as they always would, because what had begun with leftovers had become something that could never be wasted again. Not food, not kindness, not opportunity. And as Busisiwe stood at the entrance, watching the last few people leave with full stomachs and quiet gratitude, she felt it. Not pride, not relief, but peace. Because she had done what she promised herself. Long ago, she had not forgotten. And because of that, neither would the world around her. In a place once filled with hunger, there was now hope. In a life once defined by survival, there was now purpose. And in a story that could have ended in silence, there was now a voice, one that would continue, long after she was gone. Because true kindness does not end. It multiplies, quietly, powerfully, endlessly. Sometimes the world teaches us to look away, to ignore what is broken, to believe that small acts don't matter. But Busisiwe's story reminds us of something deeper, something real. Kindness is never small. It doesn't need wealth status or recognition to change lives. It only needs a willing heart. You may not have everything, you may not even have enough, but what you choose to do with what you have can become someone else's miracle. So tell me, where are you watching from today and what time is it in your country? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story touched, you don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that kindness still exists in this world.